Hey, modern world history students. We're continuing with unit number 7, The Rise of Totalitarian Dictators. And this is section number 12, Adolf Hitler, the Nazis, and their beliefs. I hope that you'll be able to explain why Adolf Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle, should have served as a warning of Hitler's intentions for Germany. You'll learn about the National Socialist German Workers' Party, also known as the Nazi Party, and the Munich Putsch, also called the Beer Hall Putsch. And then you'll learn about Adolf Hitler's ideas of Aryan racial supremacy, anti-Semitism, and Lebensraum. So first we're going to do some background on Adolf Hitler himself, and then talk about how he got involved in extremist or radical politics in Germany after World War I. So Adolf Hitler was not actually born in Germany. He was born in Austria, or I guess more technically, he was born in Austria-Hungary. He was born in the city of Vienna, which was the capital. And as a young person, prior to World War I, he visualized himself as an artist, as a painter. And he actually attended an art school in Vienna. But he was told by the professors at the art school that he probably did not have a future as an artist. The problem was that his style was boring. It didn't stand out. Generally speaking, to be a successful artist, you either have to have extraordinarily good technique or extraordinarily creative compositions, subjects. And Hitler just kind of didn't exhibit either of those. He had good technique, but not extraordinary technique. And his choice of subjects was very dull. And so he was told, look, you're not going to make it as a professional artist. And so he left art school and he made a run as what's called a postcard artist. He was painting images on small postcards. But at the time of the war, when World War I broke out, he was serving as a paper hanger, meaning he hung wallpaper in people's houses. That's what he did. He was hanging wallpaper in people's houses, which was particularly unsatisfying work for a person who envisioned himself as an artist. He had also spent quite a bit of time, because he was sort of out of prospects and out of real work, he spent time in the criminal underworld of Vienna. It was a big city, you have organized crime, and he was associated in that group of people. Vienna was a city that was the capital of an empire that was multinational. There were many nations of people that had been conquered by the Austrians over time. And so you may remember that only about 10% of the people of the Austro-Hungarian Empire were ethnically German. The rulers, the Habsburg family, were ethnically German, and the elites were ethnically German. But most people who lived in Austria-Hungary were not. The Germans, ethnic Germans, like Hitler, looked down on the non-Germans, the Slavic people, whom they saw as sort of subhuman. And they also looked down on Jews. And so in that criminal underworld where lots of people had failed at things the way that Hitler did as an artist, they tended to blame non-Germans for their own lack of success, their lack of prospects. There was a pretty strident hatred of Slavic people and Jewish people in that sort of impoverished criminal underworld of Vienna. And it's very clear that Adolf Hitler sort of adopted those views as well. But when the war broke out, his prospects seemed to change. The war offered what in his mind was the opportunity to do something meaningful with his life, a life which thus far had seemed not to have a lot of meaning, a life which had been very unsatisfying. And so the war offered the prospects of doing something meaningful. But he did not want to serve in the army of Austria-Hungary because he himself was not an elite. If he had been an elite German, he could have been an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army, but he wasn't. He was a relatively poor person And so he would have been just a soldier. And that would have meant that he would have had to serve amongst and alongside lots of Slavic people whom he didn't like. So he crossed the border over into Germany, into the southernmost part of Germany, which is called Bavaria, and he joined the German army instead. And so he was an ethnic German born in Austria-Hungary, but he migrated into Germany so that he could serve in the German army alongside Germans. And he spent almost the entire war on the Western Front. And this is a picture of Adolf Hitler. He's the guy who has the little X above his head here. He served almost the entire war on the Western Front, and he was a runner. So in World War One, by the time of World War One, there were other ways to communicate information over long distances. There was the telegraph, there was the telephone. But as you saw in the story of and there was radio, right? Wireless communications. But as you saw in the Battle of Tannenberg, radio could be intercepted by the enemy. And so really important sensitive information could not be transmitted via radio. Wired communications like telegraph and telephone could be and were frequently disrupted when artillery bombardments broke the wires. And so honestly, even during the First World War, in the 20th century, the most reliable and secure way to get a message to someone, to another officer a couple miles down the line, was to write it out on a piece of paper and hand it to a trusted runner and have the runner deliver it by hand. And that was Adolf Hitler's job during the First World War. And he did it very, very well. On multiple occasions, he exposed himself to enemy fire in order to complete his mission. And twice, he was issued the Iron Cross, which is the German award for bravery under fire. And so he was a decorated and appreciated and successful soldier in the German army on the Western Front during the war. Unlike Benito Mussolini, who really served without distinction in the Italian army, Adolf Hitler was not a big hero, but a small hero during the war. And so in the waning days of the war, in the last few weeks of the war, he, however, was hit by a mustard gas attack. And he got mustard gas in his eyes, and it temporarily blinded him. It also caught him in the face, and he had facial scarring, really, not a lot, but some facial scarring for the rest of his life from the blisters and chemical burns the mustard gas caused. But most notably, he was blinded. And he spent a period of months after the war, in the last few weeks of the war and then after the war, recovering in a German hospital. And it was during that time that the war came to an end. And the news that the war was over and the news that Germany had lost the war was a huge personal shock to Adolf Hitler. You have to remember that at the time the war came to an end, Germany had not been invaded. As a matter of fact, the German army was still in France, was still occupying parts of France. Now, they had been driven out of their strongest defensive positions in the Argonne Forest, and the German generals had concluded that there was no point in continuing the war. But the fact is that the German army was still in France, still in Belgium. And so there was a sense amongst Germans that Germany was winning the war and still in a position to win it. And that was the sense with which Adolf Hitler had left the battlefield and had entered into his recovery, that Germany was still in position to win. So the news which arrived at the hospital where he was recovering, that Germany had in fact lost the war, was devastating. It threw Adolf Hitler into almost a sort of a mental breakdown. And he later wrote in his book Mein Kampf, My Struggle, he later wrote, "Hatred grew in me, hatred for those responsible for this deed. I decided to go into politics." So for Adolf Hitler, the loss of the war could not be explained by failures on the battlefield. He had seen the German armies achieving almost nothing but success on the battlefield. And in fact, when he left the war, Germany still occupied big chunks of France and all of Belgium. So for him, the fact that Germany lost the war could only be explained in one way. Someone from inside of Germany had betrayed Germany, had sabotaged Germany, and had caused Germany to lose the war. And as a matter of fact, many, many Germans felt that way. Remember that, well, I don't even necessarily remember this, but I didn't necessarily teach this. During the war, the German government had censored the newspapers very strictly. That is, had controlled what the newspapers were allowed to print. It had even controlled what could be sent home in letters from their soldiers. They would read the letters that soldiers had written to their families and literally cut out parts that they didn't want their families reading. And so people back home in Germany, they were shielded from the news, from the information that the tide of the war had turned against the Germans. They did not know that the arrival of the Americans had brought an end to the German advance on Paris and was now turning the war against Germany. And so, as much of a shock as it was to Adolf Hitler to learn that Germany had somehow lost the war, it was equally a shock for many, many German civilians as well, who back home had not had that information come through to them. For them, it seemed as though Germany was winning the war, and then all of a sudden, seemingly out of nowhere, Germany had lost the war, and then there was the overthrow of the government and the armistice and a new government. It had all happened impossibly fast. And so, like Adolf Hitler, many Germans did not believe that Germany's loss in the war could simply be attributed to battlefield setbacks. No. Clearly, someone from inside Germany had betrayed Germany and had sold Germany out, had stabbed Germany in the back, and that's why Germany had lost the war. Adolf Hitler's response to that, he says, is hatred. Hatred grew in me. Hatred for those responsible for this deed. I decided to go into politics. So Adolf Hitler's career in politics was therefore entirely attributable to hatred. He ended up joining a radical political party that was called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. As a matter of fact, when Hitler joined it, it was simply called the German Workers' Party. Hitler joined the party and very quickly became its chief spokesperson and one of its leaders. He had a magnetic personality and a very, very quick mind. He wowed other party leaders with how quickly he could come up with arguments in debate and how effectively and how powerfully he could articulate his arguments. And so he very quickly rose into the leadership of the German Workers' Party. It was under his leadership that the party changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And I only bring that up because that is how it got its nickname, which was the Nazi Party. National Socialist German Workers' Party in German comes to something along the lines of Nationalsozialistische Deutschen Arbeiterpartie, okay? And it was that National Socialist, NASA, that became Nazi, N-A-Z-I. So Nazi was a shortened form of National Socialist German Workers' Party in German. And so we'll simply refer to them henceforward as the Nazis, or the Nazi Party. He and the Nazis decided to try to overthrow the German government. Hitler and the Nazis were determined to overthrow the German government. Remember what you learned before, that many Germans blamed the German government, blamed the government of the Weimar Republic or the German Republic for the Treaty of Versailles. It was entirely unfair. The leaders of the German government had essentially been forced by the Allied powers to sign the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, the Allies said that if they didn't sign the Treaty of Versailles, the British naval blockade of Germany would continue, and more German civilians would die. But many Germans, especially the sort of extremists who denied the reality of why Germany lost the war, many of them really did not like the German government, the government of the Weimar Republic. And even if they accepted that the leaders of the government had been forced to sign the treaty, They were outraged that the government continued to comply with the terms of the treaty. And so the German government was unpopular with its own people. It was unpopular with extremist thinkers like Hitler and the Nazis, but it was even not very popular amongst sort of normal thinking people also. And the economic chaos that then struck after the war, the hyperinflation, didn't help. I mean, it added to the unpopularity of the government. And so Hitler and the Nazis believed that conditions were ripe to overthrow the government. And in 1923, they tried. In Munich, which was the largest city in Bavaria, this very southern part of Germany, a group of Nazis conspired to overthrow the government of Bavaria. It would be like a group of radicals trying to overthrow the government of Texas, say, the state of Texas. And the idea was that having overthrown the government of Bavaria, they would then seize weapons that were in the possession of the Bavarian government, arm the population, and then march on Berlin and overthrow the German government. So you would say, well, that's a coup d'etat, right? You learned the word coup d'etat with Napoleon Bonaparte. It means a blow to the state, an attempt to overthrow the government. And that's right. It was a coup, an attempted coup. In German, the word for coup is putsch. So Hitler and the Nazis' attempt to overthrow the government in 1923 is known as the Munich Putsch. Sometimes it's called, in fact, it's more famously called, the Beer Hall Putsch, because the place where it began was one of Munich's famous beer halls. Well, the putsch failed. The coup failed. As a matter of fact, it was so poorly organized that it didn't even take the army to come in and crush it. It was put down really by local police. And Adolf Hitler and the leaders of the putsch were arrested, put on trial for treason, found guilty, and put in prison. Now, Adolf Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role in the attempt to overthrow the government. It's pretty shocking when you think about it, that a person could get off with such a light sentence for attempting to overthrow the government. But it goes to show you how not seriously people took Adolf Hitler and the Nazis at the time. They were not considered to be a real threat to overthrow the government. After all, their putsch had been defeated by local police. They didn't even have to call in the army to do it. So Hitler and the Nazis were not taken seriously. They were seen as sort of extremist clowns who had organized this thoroughly botched attempt to overthrow the local government and had failed. But yet also in that part of Germany, there was, even though they were seen as clowns who were disorganized, a lot of people agreed with their sentiments. A lot of people agreed that the government of the Weimar Republic was not doing its job well. A lot of people agreed with the premise that the government had sold out Germany in signing the Treaty of Versailles. And so a combination of support for what the Nazis believed and a sense that the Nazis were not a real threat allowed for Hitler to be sentenced to just 5 years in prison. Eventually, his sentence was reduced to 7 months. Adolf Hitler spent only 7 months in prison for attempting to overthrow the government. After that, he was released, and he was banned from public speaking for 2 years, but he only spent 7 months in prison. This clearly shows that they did not know that Adolf Hitler was Adolf Hitler, right? They didn't know the end of the story the way we do. Otherwise, we're like, keep him in jail. It's Hitler. Anyway, 7 months. Now, during that 7 months, he borrowed a typewriter and he banged out a book, which was entitled Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. And it was essentially a 300-page rant about Hitler's political beliefs. It provided a little bit of personal background, so that passage about hatred grew in me for those responsible for this deed. I decided to go into politics. It provided a little personal background, but mostly Hitler laid out his beliefs in Mein Kampf. Now, reading Mein Kampf is very difficult. Hitler is not a concise writer by any stretch of the imagination. And of course, we're not going to have you read all of it. But if you read Mein Kampf carefully, you can distill out certain themes. And what we're going to do is we're going to read a few excerpts which lay out those themes for you, which help you to understand these themes, which reveal what Adolf Hitler believed all the way back in 1923. One theme is the theme of Aryan racial supremacy. So Adolf Hitler oftentimes mistook or substituted the ideas of nation and race. So a nation is a group of people who are tied together by a shared culture, language, religion, folklore, morals, ethics. A nation is a group of people tied together by a shared culture. A race is a group of people who share genetic or biological characteristics. But Adolf Hitler oftentimes substituted the two. Adolf Hitler considered the Germans to be a superior nation, and he believed that the reason why the Germans were a superior nation was that they were also biologically, genetically superior to other nations. So he sort of blended together or substituted or confused the ideas of nation and race. And he referred to the Germans as a race, a people who were biologically different from everybody else, and as a matter of fact, biologically superior to everyone else. And it wasn't just the Germans, it was sort of the Northern Europeans, Germans, Scandinavians, French, British. He regarded them all as part of this race, which he called the Aryan race. So Hitler believed that the race of which the Germans were a part was biologically distinct from all other humans and biologically superior. So we're at the bottom of page 19 here. So summarize that idea. Hitler believed that the Germans were not just a nation, but were part of a race of people who were biologically distinct from all other people in the world, and as a matter of fact, biologically superior. Now, yes, the image of the ideal Aryan is the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, sort of German, like you see in this propaganda poster here. Hitler himself was, of course, not blonde-haired, so Aryans were not limited to blonde-haired, blue-eyed people. That was just sort of the ideal. But Aryans he considered were a superior race of people. So here's what he wrote in Mein Kampf. Nature puts living creatures on this globe and watches the free play of forces. She then confers the master's right on her favorite child, the strongest in courage and industry. The stronger must dominate and not blend with the weaker, thus sacrificing his own greatness. So this is what reminds us that Adolf Hitler was influenced by social Darwinism, the idea that some human beings are simply more fit, better adapted, superior to others. And those who have those especially strong traits become masters, rulers over those who don't. That's what he's saying there. And of course, in Hitler's mind, the Aryan race, the Germans, the Northern Europeans, had those traits which made them superior and which gave them the right to be masters of the others, rulers over the others. But he said, the stronger must dominate and not blend with the weaker, thus sacrificing his own greatness. We'll get back to that idea of blending in a minute. But then Hitler says, all the human culture, all of the results of art, science, and technology that we see before us today are almost exclusively the creative product of the Aryan. It was he who laid the foundations and erected the walls of every great structure in human culture. So this is where he's asserting his views. It's not just that the Aryans are sort of physically superior, but mentally superior also. It's not just that they have the power to rule over others, but that historically they have produced all of the great works of culture. But then he adds, the Aryan then gave up the purity of his blood and became submerged in a racial mixture and gradually lost his cultural creativeness. Blood mixture and the resultant drop in the racial level is the sole cause of the dying out of old cultures. For men do not perish as a result of lost wars, but by the loss of that force of resistance which is continued only in pure blood. All who are not of good race in this world are chaff. So this word chaff you may not be familiar with. When you harvest wheat, there's only a tiny part of the wheat that is the actual grain that you want, because you grind it up to to make flour to bake bread, okay? The rest of the wheat, the stalk and the little casing that the grain is contained in, that's chaff. You throw that away or you burn that. So what Adolf Hitler is saying, that the Germans are the grain. They're the part that is valuable because it can be made into something. The rest of humanity, those who are not of the Aryan race, are chaff. They are to be thrown away and burned. As for the Aryan, he talks about the Aryans as a master race, a race of people who are superior, genetically, biologically superior. And that genetic biological superiority is contained in what Hitler calls pure blood. And he says the only reason why the Aryan is not still the master of everyone in the world is that the Aryan made the mistake of intermarrying with other races of people, with Slavic people, whom he considered subhuman, with Jewish people, whom he considered subhuman. And it was only because of that racial mixing, as he called it, that the Aryan lost the purity of their blood and became less positioned to be a master race. So what Hitler wanted was to restore the purity of German blood, of Aryan blood, by ensuring that in the future Aryans did not intermarry or interbreed with Slavic people, Jewish people, or other people whom he considered inferior. He would rather eliminate those people from the world to make sure that the Germans, the Aryans, no longer mixed with them. So that's the theme of Aryan racial supremacy. A second theme, then, that is tied to that one is the theme of anti-Semitism, that is, anti-Jewish hatred of Jews. And a lot of people ask, freshmen always ask, why is it they know that Hitler hated Jewish people? Why did Hitler hate the Jews? He never really gives a clear answer. I mean, we know that Hitler grew up in an environment and in a culture where hatred of Slavic people and Jewish people was prevalent, and he clearly adopted that worldview. But he never gave a rationale for hating the Jews. This is as close as he ever comes. I'll read it to you from Mein Kampf. And it's hard to read and it's hard to hear, but it's what he believed, and it helps to answer this question. Wherever I went, I began to see Jews, and the more I saw, the more sharply they became distinguished in my eyes from the rest of humanity. Was there any form of filth or profligacy without at least one Jew involved in it? If you even cut cautiously into such an abscess, you found, like a maggot in a rotting body often dazzled by the sudden light, a Jew. Gradually, I began to hate them. So for Adolf Hitler, he never really answers the question of why he hates Jews. He simply says that all acts of evil, or as he says, all forms of filth or profligacy, which are fancy words for disgust and evil, right? He asks the question, was there any form of filth or profligacy without at least one Jew involved in it? And of course, normal people would answer, sure, there's lots of examples of evil that had no Jews involved. But when Adolf Hitler is asking that question, it's what you call a rhetorical question. It's not a question for which he is seeking an answer. It's a question for which he feels he already has the answer. In Adolf Hitler's mind, Jews were the root of all the evil acts of the world. When he says, was there any form of filth or profligacy without at least one Jew involved in it? His answer is no, all evil involves Jews. Jews are the source of all the world's evil. But that's as close as he ever gets to giving an answer for hating the Jews. He doesn't provide any further rationale. It's this sort of, well, come on, have you ever seen evil without Jews? And that's it. That's his answer. It's not a rationale that any thinking person would accept, but clearly that's as far as Hitler in his mind had to go to rationalize his hatred for the Jews. Gradually, I began to hate them. For me, this was the time of greatest spiritual upheaval I have ever had to go through. I had ceased to be a weak-kneed cosmopolitan, meaning a person who kind of accepted everyone, and became an anti-Semite, a person who hated Jews. At the beginning of the Great War, or even during the war, if 12 or 15,000 of these Jews who were corrupting the nation had been forced to submit to poison gas, then the millions of sacrifices made at the front would not have been in vain. So you remember that Hitler and many Germans they believed that the reason for Germany losing the war was that someone inside Germany had betrayed Germany and had caused them to lose the war, had stabbed Germany in the back. Hitler seems to have believed that among those people were the Jews, that they had corrupted the nation. And so he says, if during the war 12 or 15,000 of them had been forced to submit to poison gas, had they been murdered, then the millions of sacrifices made by German soldiers would not have been in vain. He believed that Germany could have won the war if Germany had simply murdered thousands of its Jewish population. Notice that the use of poison gas is referenced here. And as a matter of fact, in what became known as the final solution, Hitler's extermination camps, poison gas was the method used to exterminate millions of Jewish and Slavic people. So it was all kind of laid out there in Mein Kampf all the way back in 1923. Hitler also says this. He refers to something called Lebensraum, which is translated from German living space, technically living room, but not to confuse it with a room in your house. Let's call it living space. Germany was one of the fastest growing nations in Europe. And of course, in World War I, many Germans had starved to death, partially because of the British naval blockade. Hitler believed that if the German nation was to have a future, it needed more space. It needed to conquer more territory so that Germany would have enough territory to produce enough food so that Germans would never again have to rely on importing food from other nations. He wanted to ensure that Germany had enough soil to feed the German nation and keep the German nation growing and strong. So the conquering of living space was important, not necessarily for people to settle, but for Germans to farm. And this is what he wrote in Mein Kampf. Nature has not reserved this soil, meaning Europe, for the future possession of any nation or race. On the contrary, this soil exists for the people who possess the force to take it. Germany must find the courage to gather our people and their strength to advance along the road that will lead this people from its present restricted living space to new land and soil. We must secure for the German people the land and soil to which they are entitled. So Hitler says that the land of Europe belongs to whoever is strong enough to take it. The Germans need it in order to ensure their future. Therefore, the Germans must prepare to invade territory and conquer it and add it to the German Empire, the German Reich, so that the German nation will have a future. Now, Hitler was particularly looking at lands to the east. He was looking toward Poland and Ukraine and Western Russia. This is the richest agricultural land in Europe, kind of the breadbasket of Europe. It's the equivalent of Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. It's the richest agricultural land in Europe. And so Adolf Hitler clearly, as early as 1923, argued that Germany must in the future build up its forces in order to conquer this land and take it, in order to keep the German nation secure and well-fed. Dictatorship. Adolf Hitler, like Benito Mussolini, did not believe in democracy. He believed that democracy it contributed to disunity because individuals and groups of individuals would push their own interests, even if those interests were not in alignment with the best interests of the state or of the nation. And so he believed that the only way to ensure that the resources and the efforts of the nation were all being used for something good was to eliminate democracy and replace it with dictatorship. So in Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote, "There will be no majority decisions, only responsible persons. Surely every man will have advisors by his side, but the decision will be made by one man. Only he alone may possess the authority and the right to command. Absolute responsibility combined with absolute authority." Well, absolute authority, that is the very definition of dictatorship. So here's the thing. Hitler has laid out for us what he wants to accomplish for Germany. He wants to restore the Aryans to their status of pure blood. He wants to do so by suppressing people who are, as he sees it, inferior, especially Jews, whom he also regards as the source of all the world's evil. He wants to marshal the resources of Germany into military might in order to conquer additional living space to secure the future of the German nation. And he believes the only way for these things to happen is for Germany to abandon its experiment with democracy, abandon the Weimar Republic, and replace it with a dictatorship. You can see on the propaganda poster, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One nation, one empire, one leader. Now, the question is, how do you force Germany to abandon democracy and embrace a dictatorship? And this he summarizes really in just one word, or one sentence. Terror. Okay? Terror will always succeed unless opposed by equal terror. You find this in Mein Kampf. He makes it very clear that he believes that the democracy of Germany will be overcome and the resistance of other nations will be overcome through the use of terror, ruthless and total. And he believes that unless you encounter someone who is equally willing to employ terror, to employ violence against you, you will always succeed when you use terror. So, dictatorship achieved through the use of terror to force the German people into compliance. Conquest of new living space through the use of terror, violence, warfare. That was Hitler's strategy. And he laid it all out in Mein Kampf, 10 years before he ever became the Chancellor of Germany, 10 years before he really even began his steps toward being an absolute dictator, a totalitarian dictator in Germany. Hitler laid out his views of the world. He laid out his plans for the German nation. He even laid out his strategy for those plans to be accomplished. It's all there in Mein Kampf. Anybody who read Mein Kampf in 1923 or in between 1923 and Hitler's rise would have known what Hitler intended to do and how he intended to do it. But many people ignored Mein Kampf. The Nazi Party struggled even to give it away because Hitler at the time, at least at the beginning, was seen as a sort of failure. You know, he had led this totally failed attempt to overthrow the government. And his ideas were so radical that most Germans weren't interested. So it's a tragedy of world history that more people didn't read Mein Kampf and take it seriously, because basically Hitler laid out all of the things that he was going to do when he eventually took over Germany. How did all this play out? How did he take over Germany? That's the subject of our next lesson. So until then, take care of yourselves. Try to stay healthy, try to stay safe. I look forward to teaching you again. Bye-bye, Modern World History students.